What is going on, everyone? Today we're looking at the level 100 beast of a build that is the Whirlwind Barbarian. Now, I've made guides up until this point for the Whirlwind Barbarian, but I'm finally level 100 and I'm going to show you the exact build you need to be running to do enough damage to finish all of the endgame content and run extremely high level nightmare dungeons. As you can see in the gameplay, I'm able to run tier 75, tier 80 nightmare dungeons, and I can even do quite a bit of damage on Uber Lilith herself, even though the Whirlwind Barbarian is probably the worst class in the entire game to fight her. Now, this build is a one-handed build, but it's a little bit different overall than the current one-handed builds that are on YouTube. I've taken what I think is best from a lot of different builds, put them all into one build, and as you can see, I just run through high tier content, which is hard as it is on the Barbarian already, but with this build, it's made much easier. And my gear and stats aren't perfect by any means, but if you follow this formula, you will be able to do the high tier content with no real issue. And also, if you're seeing these Whirlwind Barbarians hit over 1 million, 2 million damage, and you just can't seem to do that, we're also going to fix that in this video. And I can say this is one of the best Endgame Barbarian builds, 100%. First, let's go over the skill tree very quickly. So there will be a build link in the description below, but I highly recommend you stay and watch this video through because I explain a lot of things about the build. And there's a certain way that you can play it to get a lot more DPS than you regularly would. So the first thing we're going to do is obviously just take Lunging Strike and Enhanced Lunging Strike, our basic skill. We're just going to take those two because you have to have them. They're also going to be a primary part of this build because we're going to use them to generate a lot of extra DPS. Additionally, we're going to grab Whirlwind. So we have 5 out of 5 here, and we're going to go into Furious Whirlwind, so that way we do the bleed damage as well. A lot of people don't grab Pressure Point, but I still grab 3 out of 3 here because it allows us to make enemies vulnerable after our exploit glyph wears off and gives us a decent chance to do so. Additionally, we're going to grab Rallying Cry. You can just do 1 out of 5 all the way to Tactical Rallying Cry. You can do 1 out of 5 here because once you get to endgame, you have enough resource generation and fury gen. That way you don't need to waste points in extra stats here. Additionally, what you're going to do is max Challenging Shout 5 out of 5, and this is going to go down into Tactical Challenging Shout, and this is a big one because it gives us higher damage reduction for a longer period of time. And then we're going to grab 1 out of 5 on War Cry. Again, over to Power War Cry. 1 out of 5 is plenty enough. You don't get that much extra benefit from wasting points here. So we're going to take 3 out of 3 for Booming Voice, 3 out of 3 for Raid Leader for self-healing, and 3 out of 3 for Guttural Yell, giving us a little bit more damage reduction when we use our shouts. Then we're going to come down here to our mastery skills, grab 3 out of 3 at Pit Fighter. In previous builds, we've done No Mercy, but at this point, we have enough crit chance we don't really need it. And then grab 1 out of 3 for Hamstring. And a big change to this build is Cut to the Bone. This is going to make your bleeding effects deal 18% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, and we're banking on having enemies vulnerable, so this is very important. We're going to grab 1 out of 3 for Thick Skin, and this is going to make it so that when we take direct damage, we gain Fortify. This is going to keep us hopefully in a constant state of Fortify, and then Counter Offensive 3 out of 3. And then we're going to grab Wrath of the Berserker all the way down to Supreme Wrath of the Berserker still. You can choose to change this for Iron Skin if you want late game. I just haven't really done that. You can use Iron Skin and run it so that way you get a barrier, and that gives you a little bit of defense, and you can run that with barrier aspects for a little bit more damage and defense. But right now, I like running Wrath of the Berserker. I just like that it gives me movement, and it just gives me uptime on a lot of extra damage. Then we're going to grab Tempered Fury for 1 out of 3 for the extra Fury, and then we're going to get 2 out of 3 for Invigorating Fury. We're going to grab 3 out of 3 for Wallop, which is very important for this build. It's going to make sure that our skills using bludgeoning weapons deal 30% increased damage to enemies that are stunned or vulnerable, and our enemies are going to be stunned or vulnerable or both most all of the time, and that's because you're also going to grab Concussion here, and this is going to make it so that on lucky hit, skills using bludgeoning weapons have up to a 30% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds. So while we're making enemies vulnerable all the time, we're also going to be making them stunned because of this, so you have a large chance of dealing a lot of extra damage with Wallop. And you can see I have 6 out of 3 here, and I'll explain that on my gear in a minute. But then obviously you're going to want to run Unbridled Rage for the extra damage. Here's a quick overview of the skill tree just to give you a quick glance, but again, this will be in a build link in the description. Next, we're going to move on to geared aspects, and again, I'm going to restate my stuff is absolutely not perfect, and there's still a lot of improvements that I'm looking to make, but overall, this is the setup that I like. Keep in mind, you can change aspects and what gear you put it on. Primarily, this is just how I have mine at the moment. I'm also going to throw up primary stats on the left side of the screen while I go over this gear. So the first thing we're going to look at is the helmet. So the aspect on my helmet, I have a gain 4% damage reduction for each enemy nearby that is bleeding, up to 20% maximum damage reduction. And that basically, as soon as we start our whirlwind, is going to cause every enemy around us to bleed, giving us an automatically 20% damage reduction overall, which is extremely important in game to keep you from actually dying. Again, I'll throw these stats up you primarily want on the left side of your screen, but total armor is something you want on most every piece of gear you can get it on. The maximum life is very important in game as well. And then cooldown reduction, here I have cooldown reduction on my helmet just because that's what I rolled, and I like it because it does give me quicker cooldowns for my shouts, especially our challenging shout, which is going to be our primary endgame shout, because when you don't have this up, you're going to be tanking a lot of damage. And then for our chest, you can see I don't have Rage of Haragoth here. You can use that chest if you want for your cooldowns, but once you get your cooldown reduction low enough so you're constantly able to pop your shouts, that will no longer be a problem in game. And once you get it to that point, you can then replace it with another chest that has almost every piece of damage reduction you can get. So ideally here, I might want to swap one of these out for total armor. That way I can up my total armor percentage in general. 3 main ones being damage reduction overall at the bottom, the damage reduction while fortified, which is a perfect set for this build, and then damage reduction from close enemies. Even though it's a low roll, it's still the ideal stat you want. The other thing would be damage reduction from bleeding enemies, would be another good one. And the aspect on this gear is a lot different than other people's aspect, and it's because of the way the build works. So we are going to be using our basic skill to generate extra damage, and so one thing we want is basic skills grant 20% reduction for 6 seconds. Now if you're going to use this aspect, it's good to have a high roll here, meaning the entire 6% or as close as you can get to it, because when we start attacking people, we're going to need to attack people 3 times using this gloves aspect, and that's going to give us 30% extra damage for our core skill. And so as soon as we start attacking someone with that, especially in higher tier nightmare dungeons and in-game content, they're going to hit you and do a lot of damage. So as soon as you initially hit someone with a lunging strike, this is automatically going to give you that 20% damage reduction right off the bat as soon as you start hitting them, and it's going to give you a lot of immediate protection. Next is the gloves. So obviously we want +4 ranks of whirlwind on our gloves. +3 is fine, but when you get to endgame, +4 gives you a lot of extra basically base damage. The 10.5% critical strike at the bottom is extremely important as well. You need critical strike chance on your gloves as well as the ranks to whirlwind. These are the biggest possible things you can get on your gloves. The other good thing you could get on your gloves are things like strength or things like lucky hit chance to improve that lucky hit chance of vulnerable proccing on enemies. Those would be the main kind of stats you'd want to get on here. And the big aspect we have on here where you attack enemies with a basic skill and it increases the damage of your next core skill cast by 10% up to 30%. This is really important and pairs with our chest, because as we hit enemies with our lunging strike, we automatically get that 20% damage reduction from our chest. And then once we hit enemies 3 times with the lunging strike, that's going to queue up this 30% bonus, and that is going to be snapshotted when we start our whirlwind. Now for my pants, I got away from using temerity, and I do have a better set of pants, but I'm just currently wearing these. Ideally, you want basically full damage reduction and total armor on these pants. Now, once you get into the higher tier content, temerity is not that important. You can see damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction overall, that's great. Damage reduction from close enemies, that's even better. And then ideally for that dex stat, which I can't reroll, you would want total armor here or another thing of damage reduction. Ideally, total armor in this situation would be the best. And then on your pants, you should have each point of fury generated while at maximum fury grants you fortify. This is going to allow us to stack fortify on top of our health down here, so that way we get the extra bonuses from being fortified and the extra 10% damage reduction from being fortified. For our boots, you're going to want things like fury cost reduction. That's a big one. Movement speed is a must-have on your boots. If you don't have movement speed, you're going to have a problem. Strength is another big one. And then for a fourth stat, you can pick any one of these on the left, but in this case, berserking duration isn't bad because it increases our overall berserking time. But you do want the Ghostwalker's aspect on your boots. Now for our two-handed weapons, you're going to want basically the same affixes on all of them. It's going to be vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, strength, and core skill damage. These are all going to stack in their own individual buckets and multiply pretty greatly to give you a large chunk of damage overall. And for our two-handed mace, you're going to want to throw on each point of fury you generate while at maximum fury grants your next skill 4%, increase damage up to 60%. And it's much better if you have a max roll on this aspect. Then we're going to go to our one-handed weapons, which are going to be our primary weapons for the build. The first one is going to be Ramaldani's Magnum Opus, and this is similar to other one-handed builds that people have been running. You can't change these affixes, so just live with them, but they're decently good affixes. You get the crit strike damage since it's a sword, and the big skill here that comes with this weapon is skills using this weapon deal 0.3% increased damage per point of fury that you have, but you lose 2 fury every second. And our fury regeneration, hopefully by this point, is good enough that that extra 2 fury losing per second isn't a big deal. But by getting a max roll of 0.3% on this weapon, that means if you have, let's say, like I have, almost 200 fury, if you have almost 200 fury, 100 fury for this would be 30% increased damage, and 200 fury for this build would give you 60% increased damage. So we're going to be pairing this with a mace. We're going to be running the one-handed sword and one-handed mace combo because I just believe it's really that good. And again, we have core skill damage, vulnerable damage, strength, and crit strike damage, a god roll on this weapon. And here we have skills deal up to 16% increased damage based on your available primary resource, meaning if our resource is much higher, we get a large damage increase of up to 16%. Now, ideally, some people put this on their amulet, and in some cases, I would recommend you just go ahead and put it on your amulet. That's perfectly fine. I have the armor aspect on there, which I'll go over in a minute. And then for our two-handed sword, we have the Whirlwind's critical strike chance is increased by 16% up to that 48%, which is a perfect roll in this aspect. So if you do that 48% after 3 seconds, that we're going to get an extra critical chance. Our current critical chance is 37, basically 38%. So if you add that together, that 48 plus 38 is going to be 86%, meaning after we spend just a couple seconds, we're going to have an 86% critical strike chance, which means we're going to be critting almost all the time. And you can see again, we have the vulnerable damage, core skill damage, critical strike damage, and strength. Additionally, make sure you have your emeralds in all of your slots. It's going to give us a total of like 80% additional crit strike damage by having those in here. And your armor, make sure you have either rubies or sapphires, but I'll leave that choice of what you want to do up to you. Now let's go through our rings. So the rings you're going to primarily want 4 stats, but you can mix this up depending on what you want. So the main thing you want on all of these pieces is critical strike chance, and then you want maximum fury is a definite must have. You can have max life on your rings, that's also a good alternative. And then maybe critical strike damage and vulnerable damage. You can see I'll have all 4 of those on my ring here. And again, this is our bold chieftain's ring. And then we have echoing fury, so our shout skills are constantly generating us fury. And again, we have the same rolls here for maximum fury, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, and crit strike chance. And the maximum fury here just gives us extra added benefit, again, because the higher maximum fury we have, and remember, the more max fury we have, the more extra damage we can stack from Ramaldani's sword using the skill that it has. And then our amulet here, we have fury cost reduction, cooldown reduction, damage reduction while fortified, and 3 ranks of the wallet passive. The big thing you want here is 3 ranks to the wallet passive. This is a big upgrade because it gives us 6 out of 3 and doubles our damage for wallop. Gives us a lot more damage overall. Fury cost reduction and cooldown reduction is great for this build. Ideally there, you would probably want to try and get the plus ranks to defensive skills. That way you could up all of the defensive skills fairly high. And the aspect for our amulet is disobedience, so it can give us up to 60% additional armor. And here again, you could also take max life to keep you from getting one hit by much harder enemies late game. Now this armor and my life could be a lot higher, as well as my strength, but I'm currently experimenting with some stuff. But even with this build, I'm able to run tier 75, 80, 85. Now one aspect I don't have on this build is Berserk Ripping. That's going to give us much more bleeding damage for this build. I currently don't have it on here because I'm testing out running this basic skill aspect for damage reduction. But ideally, what you would want to do if you wanted to have that set up, ideally what you'd want to do is put this disobedience aspect, in this case, on the chest where I have that aspect that I'm testing out. You would take this aspect for primary resource from one of your single-handed weapons and throw it up here on your amulet, and then apply the aspect of Berserk Ripping for bleed damage on your one-handed weapon. That way you could get it and not have to use this damage reduction aspect that I'm using. And now for our expertise, primarily we're going to be using the two-handed axe expertise. This is going to give us 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Because our main weapons are going to be Ramaldani's and the mace, we're going to be getting the one-handed sword expertise automatically because we're using that weapon, and the same with the one-handed mace. And you can see the damage bonuses we get here for stunned enemies and lucky hit for berserking increase. And then one-handed sword expertise gives us a 10% chance to gain fury, and then killing a crowd controlled enemy increases our attack speed. But again, just select this one. You get these two by default by using them as your primary weapons. And again, for our skills here, you can see I have lunging strike set to my two-handed sword, and this is what we're going to be using to generate that extra core skill damage through our aspect. And then our whirlwind is set as our Ramaldani's and our mace. Now I'm going to show the names of these boards while we go, but the first starter board you're going to want to set up just like this. We get the maximum life increases and the physical damage increases here for maximum life, because we want to take as much armor, maximum life, and damage reduction as we can. Additionally, you get the armor and the physical damage there. But basically, the ideal thing you want to do here is set up with the disembowel glyph. And this is going to make it so that killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. This is great for regenerating our shouts very quickly, and it gives us the physical damage over time, which is good for our bleeding. And then we're going to come up here and we're going to work with the decimator board, turned just like this. So once we get up here, primarily we're going to want to stick with adding the ambidextrous glyph into this spot. Now, out of all the glyphs I have, I may end up changing this one, but basically it gives us damage reduction and vulnerable damage. I may change this to imbiber or something like that, but right now this is what I'm running on it. And then we're just going to come over here and get the 20% vulnerable damage from these rare nodes, and then the damage reduction here, and then also the vulnerable damage up here for pillage. Then we're going to want to walk over here to the Warbinger board. This is going to be our next board, and we're going to use the glyph Wrath here. And this is going to make sure that our core skills deal extra increased critical strike damage, which is a big boost to our overall damage. And you're going to max out all of the dexterity nodes, and it's going to give us 49 out of 25 for this area. This is going to give us a lot of extra damage that stacks with our core skill, obviously Whirlwind. You're going to want to grab this physical damage node as well as this node down here. These nodes particularly are important because they give us max fury, which again with Realm Donnie's gives us a bunch of extra damage because our fury is higher. And then these nodes over here for core reserve, again these give us max fury. And then there's also maximum life down here and maximum life as well if you want to do that. Then we're going to come over here to the flawless technique board. Then once we do that, we're going to set the martial glyph here. This is obviously going to give us our shout cooldown. This is great because it helps us cut down on our shouts and be able to use them much quicker. Again, you can max this out 40 out of 40 strength pretty easily. And once leveled up all the way, it gives us 125% bonus to the nodes in this area. Now, some of these nodes you still need to work to get the bonus at the bottom, meaning the stat bonus. So like this one, I don't meet the willpower requirements. I haven't done my altars of Lilith yet, and as soon as I do that, I should meet that. But this is one of the reasons it's great to have some sort of all stats on at least maybe even one of your weapons, just so you can get a bunch more stats this way so you can meet some of these requirements. But again, this is going to give us 30% critical strike damage with one-handed weapons. Same for some of these down here. And overall, we're going to get 28% critical strike damage with one-handed weapons because of this as an added bonus to what we already have. Again, this is going to give us damage reduction and more damage reduction over here. And just keep an eye out for that. Again, this is critical strike damage, so these are also important because they give us extra crit strike damage and other damage bonuses. And then we're going to jump over here on our 5th board to the Weapons Master board. You're just going to trail right up here like this. You're going to grab the Iron Strength node. Again, I'm working on meeting the requirements. Same for this one, it gives us extra physical damage and more strength. And then you're going to socket Mortal Draw on this board. And once you meet the bonus requirements, basically right now we have 95.9% damage with skills that swap to new weapons. So once I go over the rotation, basically how it's going to work is, again, we're going to be hitting an enemy 3 times with our lunging strike to bump up that aspect core damage before we start our Whirlwind. And by using our lunging strike and then switching to our Whirlwind, we're swapping weapons that way. And so we're going to get a 95.9% damage increase on that. It's going to take our damage through the roof. So this is a very important glyph and board to have. And then for our final board, we're going to grab the Bonebreaker board. And we're going to want to throw the exploit glyph in here. And by now, hopefully you should have enough Paragon points if you're level 100. So that way you can meet all of these requirements. And this is obviously going to give us the effect where we make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds, which is the most basically important aspect on this entire build. And then the only thing extra you have to do here is just drop down and grab these magic nodes. So we get damage reduction while healthy. And then again, make sure you try and have all stats so you can meet some of these legendary node requirements. So that's our Paragon tree. It's based very much on as much max life, max fury, damage reduction, and one-handed critical strike damage and extra damage as we can possibly get. And again, this full Paragon board will be linked below on the actual build planner. Now, one thing I do want to go over, which is kind of confusing, especially for newer players, is snapshotting. So essentially, when you start using your Whirlwind, from the second you start using it, it snapshots current abilities and current damage bonuses that you get. For instance, these gloves, they make it so that when we hit an enemy with our basic skill, it increases our next core skill cast, meaning our entire Whirlwind, as long as we hold it, by 10%. So if we hit an enemy with lunging strike 3 times, that means we'll get the full 30% bonus here. Now, if you use Whirlwind at that point, you'll get that 30% bonus. And if you stop using Whirlwind and then start it again without doing another basic attack, your bonus will flatten back out to 0, which means you need to do this 3 times, and then you need to hold your Whirlwind as long as possible. And that's because the Whirlwind cast snapshots your current damage buff. So when you start your Whirlwind, you get some of those damage buffs, but then when you stop, they go away. You have to build them back up again, because when you start your next Whirlwind cast, it's going to re-snapshot those bonuses again. So you want to make sure you have them so that way they're current, and as soon as you use your Whirlwind, they're going to apply. That works the same for this aspect that we have on our two-handed bludgeoning weapon, so that when our actual Fury generates above our max Fury, it gives us that additional up to 60% damage for 60 stacks. You can see here at the bottom, I have 60 stacks for this, meaning I'm getting an extra 60% damage. When I use my Whirlwind, that 60% is going to apply for the entire time I'm spinning on Whirlwind. But once I stop my Whirlwind, I'm going to have to build that back up in order to get it for my next Whirlwind. And again, the same will also go for this, where our skills do up to an increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast. So I'll go ahead and run through the rotation here. But again, there's 3 primary things you want to make sure that you have. And so you can see by casting my shots here, I'm filling up my Fury meter. And once it gets past that 186 maximum, it's going to stack every single point we get additionally. And it's going to make it so that our next core skill deals 1% per each one of those stacks. So you can see now we're stacked here, because we've already done and had max Fury, and this is going to give us a 60% bonus on our next set of hits. Now, the other thing you want to make sure of is you're pushing enemies with this buff activated, and you want to make sure you're pushing enemies when you have as much available primary resource as possible, so you get this second additional buff for extra damage for how much Fury you have. So right now we have 0 Fury. So if I cast my Whirlwind, I would get this bonus, but I wouldn't get this one, which is 20% basically damage extra lost, which is big. So we want to make sure we keep this up as much as possible and cast our Whirlwind and continue to cast it as it's maxed out. And finally, again, for our gloves, because we can do a basic skill cast and get that extra core skill damage by 30%, we're going to make sure at the beginning of our attacks of a group, we get this buff from our max Fury, and we also get the 30% bonus by hitting 3 people with lunging strikes. So basically just hitting one enemy 3 times with it, and it'll give us that extra 30%. And once you stack all 3 of those bonuses on top of each other, you do a ton of damage. You can see we're going to go 1, 2, 3. We're going to cast some of our shouts, make sure our Fury is as high as possible, and then start our Whirlwind. And you can see we're hitting high into the 1 millions, even on these people, 900k, 800k, without getting any additional bonuses on top of the stuff that we've already talked about. Again, my Fury's high. I got that 60% stack down here, as you can see. So you're going to see here, we still have a 56 stack here. We're going to cast our shouts so we get our max Fury, so we get that bonus as well. We're going to do 3 lunging strikes here, and then we're going to do our Whirlwind, where we're going to hit again over well into the 1 millions. And this is going to carry over to all of those higher tier nightmare dungeons. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like it, subscribe down below. And also, I do have a giveaway on my previous video on my channel, so make sure you check that out if you want to win basically a free PC. That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed and go have fun with this build. Thanks.